API Intersection podcast listeners are invited to sign up for Stoplight and save up to $650. Use the code Intersection10 to get 10% off a new subscription to Stoplight Platform Starter or Pro. Take a look at this episode's description for more details.
I'm Jason Harmon, and this is API Intersection, where you'll get insights from experienced API practitioners to learn best practices on things like API design, governance, identity, auth, versioning, and more. Welcome back to API Intersection. So there's a thing that, with building API programs and launching APIs and all this stuff, we're so worried about getting the design right and, are we really fulfilling the right use case? And, do we have all the right development tools and all that stuff? But I think in a lot of ways, the thing that we don't talk about enough is how do we actually support this thing when it's out in the wild? And supporting APIs is innately hard. So I'm super interested to chat with today's guest, Andrei Soroker from Fogbender. That's really what they're kind of focused on and targeting on, and I'm hoping can learn some stuff for the community here on what Andrei's working on. So Andrei, tell us a little bit about yourself and Fogbender.
Thanks, Jason. Good to be here. Fogbender is a customer support platform for API-first companies. These could be SDK-first companies. We're really looking at firms that sell something that developers use primarily as their main product. And we've discovered that often the vendors, these companies that sell a contract, they just don't know who their users are. So you get an API key that's being used by 25 developers, but as the vendor of the API, it's really hard to determine the identities of these folks, who the best users are. And we're seeing a bunch of stuff being done in the space, but none of it is kind of a particularly targeted towards solving this problem. So you have a combination of community, Discord or Slack environments. You've got all kinds of stuff, but in general, there doesn't seem to be a great solution for sort of supporting many teams of developers, growing teams of developers, in some sort of a sensible, scalable way, and that's where we're looking.
Yeah, the product guy in me, I have my ears ringing from like Keith Casey talking about how much you can learn from the way people are using your API. But I guess before we go down that track, what do you, you're describing something here about this kind of chat expectation, right? Messaging expectation. But
Yeah.
what's unique about supporting developers in your view?
Teams of developers. I think the difference is, plenty of products are used sort of by developers individually. I don't know if it's an editor or a compiler or something. But when you're talking about a complex product like an API that is integrated into another complex product, and it's driving business, inevitably you're going to be dealing with an ever-changing team of very technical people who are touching their own product and the API kind of on this continuous basis. And I'm focusing on the word team. And so in my mind, I've for many years, I've believed in what I kind of call team-to-team support, where you've got the vendor's team and you've got the customer's team. And the goal is to make sure that there's kind of some succession and continuity between these teams as the relationship ages, because a couple of years go by and then no one is around from when the initial deal was struck. And how do you make sure that people don't keep relearning this stuff from scratch? How do you make sure that these two developers who work on different continents and happen to be relatively new quickly find each other and understand that they're both actually working on the same product using the same API? That's actually a very difficult problem to solve. And I think it's solved by team-to-team support, where able to maintain and keep building those relationships over time. So I think something like shared channels does it really well in Slack, where everybody knows that this channel exists and this is where this particular vendor's team congregates. But I don't think it scales particularly well. And it's also not something that's there by default. It's not in the path of least resistance, because that shared channel is not going to be on the vendor's dashboard. You're not going to be signing in, looking for the support section, and then discovering like that messaging experience there. You're going to be probably filling out a contact form, or maybe seeing an email address, support at or something. But then you also need to know or discover somehow that there exists this better team-to-team experience as well, but it's rarely the official sort of thing that's out there. So we're trying to solve the problem of how do we make that experience on the path of least resistance. If that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I having been on both sides of this equation quite a few times, I can definitely, it resonates that integration is a team affair, right? It's not like there's individuals. What's like a real and or contrived example of what this kind of looks like in reality?
Sure. So, well, I'll give you an example. So we are relatively early, but we finally have customers using our product, and one of these customers is one of our vendors. So we're kind of we're mutual customers, and this company is called XKit, and they're actually they're a CRM. They're kind of a, I don't know, you can say Plaid for CRM. Essentially, they expose a single API to work with things like HubSpot and Salesforce and other CRMs. So you don't have to build the same thing multiple times. So, the way we talk to them is they have got a dashboard. We've got our team inside of their sort of dashboard. As new developers join our team, we add them to the our XKit account. And whenever I have, there's a support button, you click on that support button and you can just kind of see it's more of a kind of a shared workspace, because it's got all the open issues that are currently there. Each one is essentially kind of a chat room. And it's not a contrived example. I think it's a very, very simple example, really. But essentially, their entire team is in there. Our entire team is in there as well. And I mean, if 5 years goes by, someone could join either one of our companies and potentially go back and discover what happened, figure out who the experts are. That's really what it is. But the key thing is we don't need to know about some special place for that support to exist. We don't need to know that there is a shared channel, right? That we need to join or open. It's just there. If you have a question about XKit and you're working on my team, there's no way for you not to discover a place where I will see your question. And that's really the crux, I think, of the solution.
Got it. Okay. So digging into that a bit on, you kind of said like Slack or Discord or these sort of things just don't really scale well, which I think this is, for me and kind of, I think the listeners here, like this is the lesson that we can learn is what's going to break for you in the future. Right. But reading into that story you told there, it sounds like the kind of blend of like ticketing and just
triage.
Discussion.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's interesting because, I mean, it's like you hit this point where, you can just have open kind of chit chat, but at some point you got to put more structure around it and you end up, having your ticketing system that you have to refer folks to, and then you kind of lose that connection, but you get this durable record of all the things, right? And now you can build metrics and all that stuff. So it sounds like you guys are trying to kind of blend that experience.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's this moment when just a conversation becomes something actionable, it's like, this is a feature that we got to build, well, what do you do? And this is when I say Slack, it's hard to scale. That's where it sort of stops scaling. Okay, we've got a thread. A couple of people know about this thread. And, this is a complex feature. It's going to take 2 months to build, and maybe some other companies are going to want it too. And then you just kind of start losing these ends. You start, I think, losing the connections. And in our world, there's a moment where you say, okay, this is a feature. Let's create a feature and let's send that feature to Jira so that there's a ticket that we can work into our sprint. But we will continue to have this dedicated, not a thread, but a dedicated, named, persistent, searchable channel that anyone will see once they enter, the support experience. You don't have to read through unnamed threads where you're not a member, so you don't get notifications. And so this is early, but we're trying to understand, well, what's the easiest way for us to create that transition from like triage, like, yeah, we think there's something there. We got to either fix a bug or create a feature, or maybe just this merits its own conversation that we think other people will be interested in. And how do we actually work that into the product? How we tie it into systems like Jira or Asana or ticketing system, where they exist for you to be responsible and not to drop the ball. That's the challenge that we're trying to tackle.
Yeah, for sure.
And the other part of this challenge is like, what if the customer actually wants to live in Slack, or what if the customer wants to live in Microsoft Teams? They really don't care how you manage those conversations. It's on you. It's on the vendor. You have to make sure that the ball doesn't get dropped. The customer doesn't care. They know about this thread. They're going to remember. They don't have to deal with 200 other, channels and unnamed threads. So we're also trying to come up with a way to integrate with the things like Slack and Teams so that end users don't have to, be somewhere where they don't necessarily want to be, or we're trying to come up with a way for these end users to get support, even if they're, not necessarily going to your website, but they assume that it's going to be in Microsoft Teams.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
So, Fogbender's a very new thing. And I think what's interesting is kind of your background and story of how you got here, in that it seems like you've kind of, been in this sort of messaging space for quite some time that kind of led you to this notion. So tell us a little bit more about kind of how you got here.
Sure. So in 2012, I decided that there needed to be a proper team messaging system because it just didn't exist. The closest thing was HipChat. And and I just remember, using it, and someone in Europe wouldn't be able to, not because it was blocked or whatever, just wouldn't connect most of the time. It was this gaping sort of need for professional, team messaging system. So that's essentially how I started building messaging products. Unfortunately, that product it was called LitChat. It ended up competing with Slack. We kind of were building things at the same time. The Slack team actually signed up for LitChat and used it. And the way we met them is we accidentally created what is now known as shared channels. We had our very first customer created a room, and we had a bug in our code, and that room was visible to us. It's like the worst possible thing you can imagine in terms of security. And we were like, whoa, this is so bad. But we ended up creating a feature out of that. So we essentially started making one of those rooms for each one of our customers to sign up. And this is how I discovered team-to-team support. I mean, some of those folks ended up using our product for like 3 years until we shut it down. And I remember just thinking, whoa, like not a single one of these people was there when we first started using the product. But I remember, I know how we met them all. They joined this company, and it was a wonderful experience. So I started thinking about productizing something like this almost 10 years ago. And then we ended up pivoting to a product called Same Room. And, one of the things we heard while building LitChat was, someone's using WhatsApp or Telegram or Slack showed up, or there were maybe, 25, 30 different tools at the time. And so we thought, let's see if we can, clearly there's no common protocol. There's like XMPP is gone, but let's see if we can just sort of brute force an integration, sort of some sort of a integration that would be invisible to the end user. And so we built SameRoom, which is a under the hood product that we reverse engineered Skype and reverse engineered Hangouts, where you could connect a Hangout to a Skype group and chat as if, nothing interesting is happening, while one team is in Hangouts and the other team's in Skype. And it was a really, really interesting project. It wasn't particularly interesting financially. But the way I narrowed in on Fogbender, so I think the thing to understand is I sort of believe that messaging really solves a lot of problems. And I think that removing communication silos, so essentially making sure that everyone can see, or at least have access to, not necessarily be pinged, but have access to communication is the right thing to do. It's sort of it's the way to scale large organizations. Hiding information is the way to make large organizations struggle. So it's a very sort of idealistic thing that I believe in. But when we got acquired, when SameRoom got acquired, I joined a large company and I became like mid-level management, product management, and immediately started building a new product where I needed segment analytics. And we brought that in, and it started spreading like wildfire within this larger organization that had, I don't even know how many offices, but many across multiple continents, and most of these developers who were building against now, segment analytics, they never got to travel. They never knew each other. They didn't know that their colleagues existed at all. Like there was no real sensible way to know that. And new developers would show up all the time, right? And I sort of watched this very nice kind of simple deployment of segment just fall apart, completely. and I kept asking myself, and how I knew it fell apart is because I was on the receiving end of overage PDFs. This is like when you start using a product too much, they start sending you these PDFs, just emailing you like, oh, you owe us $2,500 because you hit like 3.5 more million monthly active users last month. And I'm like, well, that's way more than we have users. Like that would be fantastic, but these users aren't real. And they're like, yeah, we don't know like how that happened. That's on you. And eventually you reach out to support. They say, yeah, we really don't know, but we have this other like tier where we can bump you up to, and then maybe. So it's sort of become. I'm like, how did this happen? What's going on? I realized that all these developers that were on my team, whom I didn't know, they would reach out to Segment over email or some sort of a system that is inherently designed to support individuals, receive some kind of feedback, some kind of recommendations that were, Segment doesn't know our data model. They don't know. We have 15 different IDs, right, for a user. Mm-hmm. Segment would never know which one is the correct one to use. In a 35-year-old company, that makes that happens.
Yeah.
And so I thought, what, if only we had some form of a collaborative support experience where if a new employee in Romania needed help, they would have no other way but to talk to us, as a sort of a community working on this thing together. That was it. I just thought this needs to be there on Segment's website, on their dashboard. Once I sign in, I want to see a support button. And if I click that button, I want to see everybody, all the tickets that are currently open, all the current conversations that are ongoing. And so that these misguided, silos would just not be needed or even possible. So that's kind of where it came from. But again, like it's rooted in my belief that team to team messaging is sort of the magic that makes these sorts of interactions scale.
It's funny over the years, even from kind of the SOAP era and all these sorts of things. It's just like the notion of integrating something. Folks go like, well, what's that all about? It's like it's a very messy personal business.
Yes.
right? At the
It
end of
is.
the
Yeah.
day,
Yeah.
like it's in some ways kind of a toe-to-toe affair in terms of actually making things happen. And I know certainly over the years, heard so many times, you know, individual developers trying to consume some API and just says, "Can I just talk to the dev who built this so I can understand how they were thinking about it?"
Yeah.
So, I've certainly heard that many times. I guess it's interesting to think about, how you make those things scale. Um, and it's very intriguing on like uh, within a company. And I think that sort of behavioral tracking, like you're talking about with something like a segment, is a great example. Like it may not be one team that's integrating with your API in a given company. It could be dozens, or in a very large company, hundreds. And how do
Oh
you
yeah.
support that on a team by team basis? I think that's an intriguing facet of supporting APIs that folks maybe don't think about as much, and think about it as this sort of, there is one way to support things.
Yeah, I think truly success, these big successful companies, they want to touch every department in an organization, and they try to often. Yeah, and this is how you end up with different product teams, different pyramids, using the same vendor's API and not necessarily being able to tap into each other's knowledge. The other interesting thing is one way to solve this is through community support, which sometimes works quite well. And I think one of the best examples was Stripe's IRC channel on Freenode. I mean, it was like, I, and I think there's this guy, right? I think he didn't work at Stripe, but he appeared to be a full time, like incredibly knowledgeable Stripe engineer. I think they eventually maybe hired him. There's a Hacker News story on this from many years ago, but it was one of the best ways to get highly technical support. Except you couldn't, and this is a problem with community support, is if you're working on something that you can't necessarily reveal to the outside world, you've got competitors, you can't show a stack trace because someone will know what you're using, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Then this kind of sets up these boundaries around what you can really do. And I think the other problem with that is true, like excellent community support really depends on the community providing the support. And some companies never get there. They just don't have enough of a
Mm-hmm.
community. You need to become a country, really, for there to be enough
Yeah, you
folks who are.
certainly can't start with that.
You can't start with that. Yeah, yeah. So you see, one of the problems I see with community discords or slacks is that folks think, well, we must have one, but they don't necessarily have the community. They're not a country yet. They're not big enough, and they don't have the time to sit there and be that person whose only job is to dig into other people's technical problems because they've got other things to do. They've got other customers to support. They've got code to write, whatever. So actually, we've been doing a lot of integrations at Fogbender, and I see I'm often trying to find like, well, how do I get a list of all of the repositories from GitHub? It's a amazingly non-trivial problem, and it's like you end up joining these different support chats, and often they're kind of, maybe there's going to be a bunch of people who are wondering how to do certain things, but not necessarily the folks who have the time to respond. So that's kind of another interesting angle that I'm seeing right now, where it's a fine line between accessibility to knowledge, but also kind of the mandatory secrecy of information that
Yeah.
has to be there.
No, it's two very interesting points. One is, there is often a very real sort of uh, business confidentiality in some of these discussions about, you're integrating something that no one knows about yet, and it's important that they don't.
Yeah, including your identity. You may not want
Sure.
people to know that your company is using this vendor,
Yeah.
which, by the way, means often these community support workspaces or channels are filled with folks whose names you'll never know because they're using pseudonyms. And ideally you would know as the vendor. You kind of want to know who they are.
Yeah. And I think it's true up and down the size of company scale too. I mean, I think everybody knows the stealth startup thing and all this kind of stuff. But I mean, I think of some of the bigger places I've worked where there were like, code named projects that are need to know, right?
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
it's like a huge marketing deal and they don't want it leaked. So I can totally appreciate that. I think the other facet though is like how to scale that sort of the mix of uh, sort of knowledge, expertise, kind of developer, wherewithal, and be able to scale that across many teams who are integrating. And I hear from your like you're trying to sort of provide a solution to do that. But I'm curious, like, what's your take on a way to make that reasonably efficient?
sure.
Because I mean, I gotta be honest, like, the business guy in me is going like, this all sounds really expensive, and I'm gonna have to put really skilled developers on support channels all the time. Like, oh,
Yeah, I and um, might be true. So I look at it and I try to simplify these scalability issues to some actionable problems that I see all the time. So one huge problem is that if you're a large enough company, it doesn't you don't even need to be a large enough company, but you very often will end up multiple customers asking for the same thing or roughly the same thing, and just managing that s- simple sounding thing is actually quite tricky. How many tickets should you have in your in your internal issue tracker, one or one per customer? Well, kind of either one might be problematic, right? Either solution. So we're proposing this notion where we're sort of separating the communication space. So essentially, let's just say that there's a room or a channel per customer for discussing this particular issue, but there's only one uh, issue in GitLab or Jira for that particular issue, and you can keep adding these rooms per customer, but they all tie back into the issue. And so one of the biggest, like, I think, product epiphanies I've had was when I used intercom to segment users and to communicate with users, and it's really an incredible product. And the problem with intercom, though, is that it's really designed again for segmenting individuals and not necessarily teams. So what we're trying to do is say, okay, let's borrow from intercom's idea of segmenting your customers, but let's segment teams. Let's say that we have 200 customers, and let's say that 50 of them have asked for this feature. So let's over time, create this segment of 50 teams. And these teams are changing over time. Remember, they're not static, right? Like, new developers come, old developers go. And let's come up with some kind of a way to communicate with these 50 teams at the same time, in a way where you could do this in intercom, right? You can sort of send this broadcast message to everybody who is interested in this particular thing, and ask them, for example, to try like a beta version. We're building, or we've kind of built a similar thing for teams, where you can say, hey, you know what? I've got this question for everyone who wants this thing or has complained about this thing. And let's send a broadcast into just kind of a public broadcast to every one of these 50 rooms where we know there are 50 teams sitting there waiting for us to implement this thing for them. And actually, I think that's maybe how it scales, is where you learn how to segment, but not individuals, because that doesn't work. You segment your teams, your customer teams, into folks who need this or need that, or have complained about that, or have had this problem, or have paid you this much money, and then you start kind of paying attention, maybe based on certain criteria, or you start broadcasting messages based on certain criteria. I think that's how it scales. And I think it does scale. And I think if you look at the most successful API first or API driven company in the world, they're not going to have millions of customers. It's never millions. It's maybe
right.
tens of thousands, maybe.
Well, there could be millions, but in terms of those that pay, it's often a much smaller community.
Yeah, well, it's true. But when you're looking at, again, deals signed, right? These deals signed,
Sure.
You're generally dealing on the order of, if you're very successful. I think Okta has like 10,000 customers or something. It's a relatively small amount. And this is sort of where we run into this problem, I think, with support tools all of them, all of the existing support tools are designed for scale. They're designed for Adidas, and Adidas has, I don't know, 2 billion customers or something, right? But look, TurboTax, I don't know, millions of customers. And so that scale ends up, I think, really taking up all the product effort of, a Zendesk or an Intercom or a Front. And they just don't have the time to if you look at Zendesk's organizational features, these are features dedicated to supporting organizations. They really nothing's happened there in I don't know, 10 years because there just there's just not that much traffic coming from those companies. And what Zendesk doesn't know that this customer pays $1 million a year, not 12, right? That's kind of the difference. It's hard to.
I think
It's hard to.
there's a couple of bits that I'd call out that are lessons in here, and I think the first is the support experience is often has to be either super integrated or super fragmented, your choice, in the sense that sort of identifying how often do you have support issues around the same kind of thing can be hard.
Yeah.
Especially when you're going from sort of a messaging environment to some form of ticketing system, which then, as we all know, turns into some kind of developer-oriented issue, which is often a different thing than the support tool itself. So I think that's an interesting insight of stitching all that together and getting to something that, especially for product managers, that you can look and clearly understand where your priorities should lie.
Yeah.
Is hard. And then I think the second bit is I think you're recognizing that this sort of bottoms up adoption within organizations, the idea that it's, sure, there may be an individual who's trying something, but if you really have, someone inside of a company using your product, and then suddenly you have 2 or 3 or 50 teams using it, at some point there's kind of a, that's where you can really engage and get those bigger deals with the organization as a whole. But mapping out the organization as part of that, I think a lot of people underestimate the value of that, of not just saying, we see 20 people in your organization using this, but that we're actually able to map out there's 20 different teams, and it's these individuals who are using it can actually have a much greater weight in sort of, bringing them to the table on a bigger deal.
I think the product movement is trying to capture this is called product-led growth, where it's a marketing term, but it's really trying to sort of formalize some of the dynamics around bottom up adoption, as opposed to what I kind of call steak dinner adoption, right? Where you have a bunch of nice steak dinners, and then the contract is signed, and then the implementation phase begins. And that's becoming rare, just for all kinds of reasons. And I actually think one of the dangers for a vendor whose product is being adopted bottom up is to miss the point where a big deal is on the table. They may not understand that this is an old school publicly traded company that's using their stuff. They've never seen it before. They've never seen the name. They don't care. And I think that's happened to us actually with Segment. They didn't really understand the opportunity that was on the table, and because it was really used by just such a small team initially, and then they kind of missed the spread.
It's funny. I said at the beginning that this support stuff is something that I think for a lot of API programs sometimes we don't put enough thought into. And look, we just rattled through how it can inform your product team on where things are hurting. It can inform your sales organization on how this sort of land and expand bottom up adoption is going, as well as just sort of foster a better relationship on a team and individual basis that leads up to that point that you may have kind of a bigger enterprise level deal on your hands. So fascinating stuff.
Absolutely.
It's funny because so often we think, how do we make sure that this isn't going to be too expensive and that we're going to have enough documentation, right?
Right. Yes, absolutely. Yep. The other super interesting thing just to is knowing when your good users leave, When if you're selling an API first product into a large organization, you want to know when your best technical champion departs. And that's a signal that, by the way, they never reach out and support because they know everything better than your own team, and just getting that signal that this person went to work somewhere else is important for two reasons. One is you should go and sell your thing to this next company where they're going. And two, you may not be able to renew your deal with the old company because all of a sudden the champion is gone. And so just knowing that is automatically, without spending human hours,
Yeah, that is super true. That one resonates for me
things.
all day long. Trust me.
Yeah.
Well, Andrei, I really appreciate you sharing all this with us. I think it gives our listeners here a lot of things to chew on. That support is more than just having the docs and opening tickets and that sort of thing. There's really a lot to unpack, and sort of messaging integration of it all. It's super interesting what you guys are doing.
Thank you. This is great.
Thanks for listening. If you have a question you want to ask, look in the description of whichever platform you're viewing or listening on, and there should be a link there so you can go submit a question, and we'll do our best to find out the right answer for you.